My father led the campaign to pacify them, and he died on that island. The samurai retreated after he fell. Now something monstrous has taken root on Iki Island. I have to go back.
So begins Jin's journey of facing his biggest fear, his biggest regret of failing his father. Frozen by fear, Jin watched his father die, killed on an island run by raiders, murderers, and thieves. His father's death was seemingly the end of the famed clan Sakai. Jin was no samurai, he was no leader. His honor and dignity perished with his father in Iki Island, and it was possibly going to remain that way had Lord Shimura not stepped in and trained him to be the greatest swordsman clan Sakai had ever seen. But that doesn't remove the pain, it doesn't bring his father back. Kazumasa Sakai's death left Jin traumatized and embarrassed to the point he refused to don on his father's armor during the main events of the story. Armor, and a sense of honor that was tied to said armor he battled with during the main story of Ghost of Tsushima, seemingly leaving it undisturbed at his family's estate in Omi village for 15 years. The campaign on Iki Island, the last time he spent watching his father grace, or shall I say dominate the battlefield, is really nothing but a series of memories he hoped to forget. Memories so intense in shame and regret, even during his time as the ghost, he refused to look back, he refused to face them. If he could have it his way, he'd leave them buried deep in the past, locked on the island of Iki, a place he was content leaving to its own devices until the new threat from Iki Island washed up on the shores of Tsushima, what was now the ghost's home. The Tale of Iki Island is a phenomenal DLC, one that further explores the upbringing of Jin, a personal adventure of not only finally facing his past, childhood memories of him failing his father, and his father likewise failing Jin, as Kazumasa Sakai didn't believe he could be the parent to Jin that his mother was. Once Jin's mother passed away, it was said Kazumasa grew cold, not having an effective way to get through to his son to find common ground to bond. He instead hoped to set an example for the young boy, diving more passionately than ever into his duties as a samurai. Kazumasa utilized the battlefield as a way to parent his son, obtaining victory at whatever the cost and showing Jin indirectly what it means to be a Sakai, strong, fearless, and at times quite terrifying. Kazumasa Sakai, leader of Clan Sakai, had a reputation for being an impressive warrior and skilled military leader long before his invasion of Iki. According to his own samurai warriors, he achieved victories in the face of overwhelming odds time and time again, both by using diversionary tactics to outmaneuver his enemies, even on terrain he was unfamiliar with. The diversions he created allowed him the time necessary to assess the terrain, a momentary advantage he spent no time capitalizing on. He moved with a swiftness and ferocity unheard of, so even if an enemy managed to catch him off guard, few, if any, could hope to defeat him in battle. Once in battle, it was said during the Jukusen Rebellion, Kazumasa struck an opponent so hard he broke his enemy's blade in half. All who witnessed this incident immediately surrendered, resulting in the rebellion brought to a swift end, practically overnight. With Kazumasa feeling most at home on the battlefield, or as he puts it, he's the lightning in the storm, the avalanche that topples a mountain. His strength and thirst for battle granted him spectacular success on the battlefield, immense achievements that could not have gone unnoticed. A skilled warrior and a gifted military leader, Kazumasa was also an obedient servant to his Jito, never outshining the emperor that he served. He was the wrathful arm of the emperor, the warring face of the samurai code. At some point, the Jito's attention was turned on Iki, perhaps being a thorn in his side, a beacon of all who defied his rule and the code of the samurai. With the Jito wanting to bring law and order to the island of Iki, Kazumasa was placed in charge of the military campaign meant to pacify the island. A campaign that was designed to bring these raiders that were in control of the island to their knees. Iki was an island off the coast of Tsushima. The island, as I said, was not under the Jito's control, nor was there any central system of law. Instead, the island was a haven for criminals, with a few varying raider clans serving as the only lawmakers, with an occasional outbreak of skirmishes from one clan to the other. Now, we know Kazumasa was in charge of the expedition, but there are some details that are a little bit contradictory in terms of who served underneath him and how Kazumasa operated on the island. I feel it's important to point out because in a previous video, I went into the history of Clan Yarikawa, a clan that was disbanded and held a severe level of contempt for Lord Shimura. Yarikawa rebelled against Lord Shimura, and they almost won the rebellion, but due to the intervention of Clan Adachi and Clan Sakai, the tide was turned, saving what would have been the inevitable death of Lord Shimura and the end of his clan. But Clan Yarikawa, Adachi, and Shimura are all seen serving underneath Clan Sakai in some of the flashback memories, which for me calls into question when exactly the Yarikawa rebellion takes place. The Iki invasion is 15 years before the main game, and the Yarikawa rebellion is said to be roughly 20 years before the main game. But if that's the case, and the Yarikawa rebellion already happened, with the Clan Yarikawa being disbanded, why would they be allowed to have banners of their disbanded and exiled clan? I mean, I guess you can write it off as Jin misremembering things or the rebellion taking place as soon as they come back from the invasion of Iki, and it's not necessarily Jin's father that helps with the rebellion, but the samurai that served underneath him. And because Jin was taken under Shimura's wing and Kazumasa was dead, Lord Shimura just inducted Clan Sakai samurais into Clan Shimura. That would make sense, but I just found it interesting. That confusion aside, with Clan Sakai taking the lead, you would have Clan Yarikawa, Shimura, and Adachi serving underneath him, with Clan Yarikawa being known for their gifted swordsmen, and Clan Adachi having a reputation as great builders, as Clan Adachi is responsible for the construction of the Golden Temple in Lake Ariake, the lighthouses all around Tsushima, and they improved the fortifications around Lord Shimura's castles, with the clan specializing in fortifications and some kind of infrastructure, Yarikawa for the prowess in battle, and of course Kazumasa's own impressive skills, further bolstered by the samurai serving underneath the actual banner of Clan Sakai. The invasion force seemed to have the manpower to overwhelm their enemies, the skills required to defeat them in head-on combat, and the knowledge to rebuild villages, destroyed infrastructure, or build massive fortifications, like in the case of establishing Fort Sakai, the beacon of samurai power and prestige. It's said at some point after the landing on Iki, a smuggler wanted by Lord Shimura, who went by the alias the Viper, made contact with Kazumasa. In the DLC, you actually face the Viper, during which he confirmed that at some point in time he did have some kind of duel against Kazumasa. This is confirmed by him saying he never got the feeling of his little finger back after the day he faced Jin's father. Interestingly enough though, despite the Viper being a wanted smuggler for quite some time and Kazumasa knowing exactly who he was, he didn't arrest him or try to capture him for Lord Shimura. He seemingly let him go. No further details on why Kazumasa made this decision, if the Viper was allowed to walk free in exchange for valuable information on the raiders dominating the island, or if he chose to do it out of the kindness of his own heart. This is never elaborated on. But it does show Kazumasa isn't as rigid on laws or criminals as Lord Shimura is. In one of our flashbacks, after what appears to be the samurai immediately establishing a foothold on the island of Iki, Kazumasa is holding a meeting with his commanders, a meeting that will set the tone for this invasion going forward. He holds no value of the inhabitants of the island, referring to them as rats, vile, greedy, and vicious. He tells his commanders every man fighting underneath him owes at least 5 heads each. For his best commanders fighting directly underneath Kazumasa, they owe him 50 heads each, with the meeting concluding with them riding out to Mount Takanotsuji. This supposed identified raider camp would not have been too far from where Fort Clan Sakai was erected. With the fort's construction happening sometime during this invasion, it would make sense for it to be built after Mount Takanotsuji was cleared. If this camp was cleared this early on in the meeting we see Kazumasa have with his commanders happening before anything else, it'll prove Kazumasa's warriors were encouraged to view their enemies as disgusting beings unworthy of life, a position that was reinforced through the incentive provided of bringing a high body count to their leader. The legacy of Kazumasa was already being set, however, this assault on Mount Takanotsuji was against a raiding camp of people wanted by the Jito, criminals that have chosen a life of killing and robbing. These aren't sympathizers or civilians, not yet anyways. Right now, it's all about sending a message that the samurai have arrived on the island of Iki to restore peace and order. All who falsely believed they were in charge of this land would be cut down or forced to submit to their new rulers.
This wasn't about glory. It was a message to all of Iki. Harbor these raiders at your peril.
Kazumasa slowly started clearing the island of any raiders he could find. He was especially harsh on sympathizers of the raiders. In the eyes of Kazumasa, if you hit a raider sparing their death at the hands of the samurai, then you were no different than the criminals you're helping. He ended up adopting a fierce policy of attrition directed towards anyone foolish enough to help out the raiders. If villages were discovered to be hiding any raider or helping them in any way, the village would be burned to the ground. Men of the village were to be executed. Some of them were to be left on display as warning for all of what exactly would happen if they were foolish enough to help out these criminals, these degenerates, these lowlifes. Some were left hanging from trees or locked in what appears to be some kind of torture devices, while others were just decapitated, left with their bodies and severed heads rotting in the mud. No one was safe. You either allied with the samurai, who was quickly developing a reputation of blood and destruction, hoping to get spared of the invaders' wrath, or you helped the raiders and run the risk of death and destruction of your home if discovered. Such events were common all over Iki, but the village of Kitafure was set as the biggest example of the samurai's wrath. The events where Kazumasa's growing reputation as the Butcher of Iki was truly solidified. According to Jin's account of the village, it was responsible for hiding many fighters holding out against the samurai. They were responsible for setting up traps that killed and maimed countless samurai warriors. The village also housed assassins, people that went far enough to infiltrate samurai camps and slit their throats while they slept. Kitafure was a moderately sized village that also supported a decent population of civilians. Relatives to the raiders waging war against the samurai and innocent people both lived here. It was a dangerous gamble to be living within this village. Should the village be discovered as the hotbed of all this terror being waged against the samurai, all who lived here would be guilty of the worst crimes, a guilt that one day they will be punished for. Seemingly out of nowhere, samurai appeared, with a thirst for blood like never before. Women, children, and men hid in their houses and granaries, doing their best to be as little of a threat as possible. But this effort was futile. The samurai just lit the buildings on fire, forcing the occupants to run to the center of the village. Hoping the retreat deeper into the village would grant some sort of protection, whether by way of numbers or maybe they can all unanimously surrender, granting some level of mercy, they were sadly mistaken. With the villagers' backs turned to the samurai, they were perfect targets for archers or swordsmen that were swift enough to catch them as they ran for their lives. These people did not have a chance for redemption. They were all responsible for crimes punishable by death. Death that was handed out indiscriminately to everyone that day. After the outskirts of the village was burned, the inner village was soon penetrated by the samurai. It doesn't sound as if the village really put up that much of a fight. In a flashback, Jin mentions these were villages with rusted blades. They had no thirst for battle.
How were these raiders at your peril?
These weren't warriors. They were untrained villagers with rusted...
Enough! I require a private word with my son.
Even if that was the case, Kazumasa refused to turn a blind eye to hiding raiders, especially ones responsible for claiming samurai lives and inventing such ingenious traps of maiming men. After the initial killings ended, Kazumasa ordered the rest of the village be burned to the ground, along with any man still breathing to be executed. There will be no survivors. Kazumasa was getting the body count he wanted from his men. He was achieving his goal of pacification, however it did come at a price. The massacre of Kitafure put Kazumasa's life on a clock. If he wasn't the most hated man on the island before, he was now. The samurai would consider to be the biggest threat to the entire island's way of life now. It was such a big deal, in fact. 15 years later, a mythic tale surrounds the Butcher of Iki. His tales of blood and destruction made what the island is going through during the Mongol invasion seem like nothing more than just another small war with a raiding tribe. As a child, Jin witnessed the death and suffering at Kitafure village. Even though he did not agree with what his father was doing, disturbing him quite deeply to the point of questioning how a victory should or shouldn't feel as a warrior. Despite this, Jin would still go on to cherish his father, even saying he hoped to honor the name and legacy of Kazumasa, to uphold the moniker as the Butcher of Iki. As word spread about the massacre at Kitafure, the tribes of the island decided to band together. Finally, they realized they were better off establishing a united front to face the bloodthirsty samurai. They had no hope of being spared by Kazumasa's blade at this point. Any diplomacy was long gone. Kazumasa was ordered to get the island under control, and he only saw one way of doing that: bloodshed. He didn't care that his means of achieving these objectives came at the cost of both his clan's reputation and the reputation of the samurai as a whole, a class that already held a negative perception on this island. In the wake of what happened at Kitafure, the raiders plotted to take the Butcher by surprise. The exact details of how the plan was supposed to work out isn't known. During a mythic tale on the legacy of Kazumasa, the storyteller says the raiders focused on Jin, using him as a way to lure Kazumasa into a trap that was meant to be set up at Senjo Gorge. If true, it puts some of the events into a different perspective. Considering Jin was brought along by Kazumasa as a way for him and his son to bond, Kazumasa's cruel treatment of the natives and individual skirmishes proving his skills as a warrior, efforts of trying to kill him head-on would be futile, so his Achilles heel would actually be his son Jin. Kazumasa already viewed Jin as weak and more of a poet than a warrior. If his actions here on the island were making him more and more enemies by the day, if the raider camps were completely wiped out, you're still running the risk of leaving a population seething with hatred for all the torment and displacement caused, creating an environment that was dangerous for any samurai, especially one with a Sakai name. If Jin was the focus during the trap at Senjo Gorge, then on some level Kazumasa's death would technically be Jin's fault. But he's never heard saying that his father died saving him, nor does he hold any guilt over what happened at Senjo Gorge other than not standing up to the raider who gave his father the final blow. True or not, it is confirmed even after being caught off guard, Kazumasa was still able to strike down dozens of raiders, with the tide turning against him after his horse was killed, resulting in him twisting his ankle. With all fellow samurai killed, Jin and Kazumasa were forced to retreat deeper into Senjo Gorge. Unknown to the pair, as Kazumasa limped deeper into Senjo Gorge, he was walking into another trap. More raiders lay in wait for the butcher's arrival. Senjo Gorge would be the final place Kazumasa would live. The butcher of Iki here would succumb to his wounds and overwhelmed by the number of raiders. His myth and legend was no more. His death, however, didn't end all the suffering he was responsible for. Kazumasa's pacification of Iki Island imposed generational terror. 15 years after his death, those still alive who witnessed the butcher's exploits firsthand were still fearful of any samurai. The island of Iki became resentful more than ever of any samurai, especially a Sakai. Fort Sakai was taken over, fruits of the raiders' victory, and a mythic tale surrounding Kazumasa and his horse was also born. Originating in Sasho Bay, the inhabitants show a high level of fear of any kind of samurai armor, terrified that the Butcher of Iki has been resurrected, brought back from death to reclaim all the lives that he wasn't able to take while he was still alive.
It's the Samurai Butcher, back from the dead!
They fear my armor.
The people on this island are still traumatized of the events almost 2 decades ago, almost as if trapped in a nightmare that only became more inescapable with Kazumasa's passing. As the main story of Ghost of Tsushima shows, Jin was deeply affected by his father's death, as anyone would be. He felt infinitely more responsible and lost due to his inability to save his father, blaming himself for his father's death due to his inability to scrape up enough courage to defend him. Watching some flashbacks between Kazumasa and Jin and comparing those to Shimada and Jin, it's easy to see the conflict Jin really had as a kid. Kazumasa had no problem using unsavory tactics. Fear and terror wasn't uncommon for him, and the campaign on Iki would be the first time Jin was exposed directly to any type of warfare. Kazumasa's methods weren't glorious, sure, but they got the job done, and that's what ultimately mattered. Shimada, on the other hand, was all about honor and glory. While Jin was stuck in this mentality of despair and regret, Shimada had to build him back up to show him what it was to be a samurai in according to what a samurai was in Shimada's eyes. He raises and trains him to be honor-bound as he is. As Jin grows into adulthood, caught in the middle of the Mongol invasion, he makes the conscious decision to implement fear and terror as his father did. Useful weapons that ended up being the very reason such a deep rift developed between him and Shimada. Shimada was honor-bound. Kazumasa was bloodthirsty. Jin would end up being neither. He would go on to do what was necessary, no matter how terrifying that might be, but not if it came at the cost of the lives of innocent people. The honor of the clan, the honor of the Jito wasn't above the lives of common folk. He didn't follow the same path as either of these leaders. He carved his own way, and by learning how different Kazumasa was through the tale of Iki, it just brings up the question, would his father approve of him as the ghost, or would he also deem his son as a traitor just as Shimada and the Jito did?